The old Morrison barn had been empty for 3 years, ever since the family lost the farm to the bank and moved to California, chasing promises of factory work. Now it stood like a weathered monument to better times on the outskirts of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, its red paint peeling and its roof sagging under the weight of too many harsh winters. That's what everyone in town believed, anyway. They were wrong. Deep in the hayloft, behind bales that had been strategically ranged to create a hidden alcove, 5 children had made a home that the adult world knew nothing about. 12-year-old Emma Chen was the unofficial leader, her dark hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail, her clothes clean but obviously mended multiple times. She'd been taking care of her younger siblings since their mother disappeared 6 months ago, and she carried the weight of that responsibility in the serious set of her shoulders. "Emma, I'm hungry," whispered 7-year-old Lily, the baby of the group, as she pressed close to her older sister in the pre-dawn darkness. Her voice was small and tired, the voice of a child who'd learned not to ask for much. "I know, sweet." Emma whispered back, stroking Lily's fine blonde hair. "When the sun comes up, we'll go find something." The other children were already stirring in their makeshift beds of old blankets and hay. 9-year-old twins Marcus and Maya huddled together as they always did, their dark skin barely visible in the dim light filtering through the barn's broken boards. At 10, Oliver was the tallest despite being younger than Emma, his red hair a beacon even in the darkness, his freckled face serious as he listened to the conversation. They were an unlikely family, 3 different ethnicities, no blood relations except the twins, all thrown together by circumstances that no child should have to navigate alone. But they'd become something more powerful than biology. They'd become a unit, a pack, a family forged by necessity and sealed by love. "The farmer's market opens at 8, Oliver said quietly, his voice still rough with sleep. "Mrs. Henderson sometimes drops apples when she's loading her truck." Emma nodded. Oliver had become their expert at knowing the routines of the town, the patterns that allowed them to scavenge for food without being seen. He had a gift for observation and an almost supernatural ability to predict adult behavior. "And there's that construction site near the library," added Marcus, always thinking practically. "The workers leave their lunch coolers out sometimes. We don't steal from working people," Emma said firmly, a rule she'd established early in their strange existence. "We only take what's been thrown away or forgotten." It was a moral line that might have seemed arbitrary to adults, but it was crucial to Emma's sense of who they were. They might be homeless, they might be hungry, but they weren't thieves. They were survivors, but they were good people. The children had been living in the barn since late spring, when the last of their temporary housing situations had fallen apart. Emma's mother, Linda Chen, had struggled with addiction for years, cycling through rehab programs and temporary jobs, moving the family from apartment to apartment, relative to relative, shelter to shelter, when she disappeared, whether by choice or because something terrible had happened. Emma had made a decision that would have terrified most 12-year-olds. She would keep her family together, no matter what. The other children weren't technically her siblings. They were kids she'd met in various shelters and temporary placements, children who'd been separated from their own families by the chaotic machinery of an overwhelmed foster care system. But when Emma ran, they ran with her. When she found the barn, they helped her make it livable. When she made rules for their survival, they followed them without question. "Tell us the story again," Lily requested, settling back into the warm hay. It was a morning ritual that helped ease the transition from sleep to the challenges of another day. Emma smiled in the darkness. "Once upon a time, there was a family of 5 children who were the bravest, strongest, smartest kids in the whole world." She told them the story she'd created for them, a tale where they were heroes on a secret mission, where their hiding was temporary, where they had powers that made them special instead of circumstances that made them vulnerable. The other children listened with the focused attention of audiences who needed hope more than truth. As the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Emma prepared for another day of the delicate dance they'd perfected over the past 4 months. They would emerge from the barn in carefully timed shifts, never all together, never in ways that would draw attention. They would find food, gather supplies, check their various hiding spots for useful discarded items, and return before dark. Remember the rules, Emma said as they prepared to start their day. Stay quiet, stay hidden, stay together. The children recited in unison. It was their mantra, their prayer, their survival strategy. If anyone asks questions, Emma prompted. We're visiting our grandmother, Oliver answered. She lives on Maple Street, and we're not supposed to talk to strangers. If we get separated, meet back here before sunset, the twins said together. No matter what. And if something happens to me, this was the question Emma hated most. But she knew it was necessary. Oliver takes care of everyone, Lily said solemnly. And we go to Mrs. Patterson at the library if we need help. Mrs. Patterson was their emergency contact, though she didn't know it. Emma had observed the elderly librarian for weeks, noting her kindness to children, her gentle way of dealing with difficult patrons, her habit of leaving small snacks out for kids who looked hungry if something went wrong, if Emma was hurt or caught. Mrs. Patterson was the adult most likely to help rather than simply call the authorities. As they prepared to leave their sanctuary, none of them noticed the figure watching from the edge of the property. Jake Morrison had been coming to check on his family's old barn every few weeks, since they'd lost the farm. At 28, he was working construction jobs around Cedar Rapids while trying to save enough money to maybe someday buy back the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. It was probably a hopeless dream, but it was the only one that made the loss bearable. He'd arrived early this morning intending to assess storm damage from the previous week, but the sounds from the barn had stopped him cold. Whispered voices, the rustle of movement, the unmistakable sounds of people trying to be quiet. His first thought was vagrants or drug users, and he'd been ready to call the sheriff. But as he crept closer and listened, he realized the voices belonged to children, young children, talking about food and survival and taking care of each other. Jake crouched behind the old tractor that sat rusting near the barn, his mind racing. Kids living rough was nothing new in rural Iowa. The economic downturn had hit farming communities hard, and plenty of families were struggling. But these children seemed to be completely on their own, and that was something else entirely. As he watched, a small girl with blonde hair emerged from the barn, looked carefully in all directions, then gestured to someone inside. A red-headed boy appeared next, then 2 children who looked like twins, and finally an older girl who was clearly in charge. They moved with practiced stealth, spreading out in different directions, each carrying a small bag or container. They weren't playing. This was survival behavior, and it broke Jake's heart to see children so young executing it with such precision. The older girl, she couldn't be more than 12 or 13, paused near the barn door and looked directly at the spot where Jake was hiding. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Jake saw something in her gaze that made him stay frozen in place. It wasn't fear, exactly, it was assessment. She was evaluating him as a threat, determining whether he posed immediate danger to her family. After what felt like an eternity, she turned and followed the other children toward town, moving with the cautious grace of someone who'd learned to navigate the world as a potential enemy. Jake sat in the morning quiet for a long time, trying to process what he'd witnessed. 5 children, living in his family's abandoned barn, taking care of each other with a competence that spoke 2 months of practice. They were clean, organized, obviously following some kind of system that was keeping them alive and together. But they were also kids who should be in school, in homes, being taken care of by adults instead of fending for themselves in a barn that wasn't even weatherproof. Jake had a decision to make, and he knew that whatever he chose would change the lives of 5 children who'd already endured more than any kid should have to face. He could call the authorities and let the system sort it out, knowing that the children would almost certainly be separated and placed in different homes or institutions. Or he could try to help them himself, though he had no idea how or even if that was possible. As he walked back to his truck, Jake Morrison had no idea that his decision would end up changing his own life as profoundly as it would change theirs. Emma had noticed the man by the tractor. After for months of hypervigilance, she'd developed an almost supernatural awareness of when they were being observed. The way birds suddenly went quiet, The shift in the quality of morning light when a shadow fell where it shouldn't. The prickle at the back of her neck that meant safety had been compromised. She'd seen him crouched behind the rusted John Deere, watching them emerge from the barn with an intensity that made her stomach clench with fear. He was young, probably in his 20s, with dark hair and work clothes. That suggested he belonged to the world of adults who had jobs and responsibilities, and the power to destroy everything she'd built. "What's wrong?" Oliver asked when they regrouped near the old grain silo that served as their first checkpoint. He'd learned to read Emma's moods with the accuracy of a seismograph detecting tremors. "Someone was watching the barn," Emma said quietly, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. "A man. He saw us." The effect on the group was immediate. Marcus and Maya moved closer together, their twin telepathy allowing them to communicate. Worry without words. Lily's eyes went wide with the kind of fear that broke Emma's heart every time she saw it. Oliver straightened his shoulders, preparing to step into the leadership role they'd practiced but hoped never to need. "Do we run?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite being only 9 years old. Emma had taught them about running, not just the physical act, but the decision matrix that would determine when their current situation was no longer viable. They had 3 backup locations scouted and prepared: an abandoned farmhouse 12 miles north, a cave system near the Winnebago River, and as a last resort, the storm drainage tunnels under Cedar Rapids. But running meant starting over. It meant leaving the carefully constructed safety net they'd built around the barn, the known routines and reliable food sources, and the sense of home they'd created in the hidden loft. "Not yet," Emma decided. "We watch him like he watched us. We figure out what he wants and what kind of threat he is before we make any big moves." "How do we watch him without him seeing us?" Lily asked. Oliver was already thinking ahead. "Same way we've been watching everyone else. We learn his patterns, figure out where he goes, what he does." They'd become expert observers over the past months, cataloging the habits of the adults whose routines intersected with their survival needs. They knew that Mrs. Henderson at the farmer's market always arrived at 7:45 and left apples rolling around her truck bed. They knew that the construction workers at the library site took their lunch break at exactly noon, and sometimes forgot drinks in the coolers they left outside. They knew which store clerks were likely to chase away kids who lingered too long, and which ones might offer a free apple or pretend not to notice when small items found their way into small pockets. Surveillance was a skill they'd mastered out of necessity. Now they would turn it on the man who'd discovered their secret. Jake Morrison, meanwhile, was discovering that knowing about the children and deciding what to do about them were entirely different challenges. He'd spent the previous evening researching Iowa's child welfare system, calling it academic curiosity, when his girlfriend Sarah asked why he was suddenly interested in foster care statistics. What he'd learned had confirmed his worst fears. The system was overwhelmed, underfunded, and statistically likely to separate the children rather than keep them together. He'd also driven past the barn 3 more times, ostensibly checking for storm damage, but actually hoping to catch another glimpse of the mysterious family that had claimed his childhood sanctuary. On his second drive-by, he'd spotted 2 of them, the twins carefully picking through the dumpster behind Murphy's grocery. They worked with systematic efficiency, one keeping watch while the other selected discarded produce that was bruised, but still edible. When they noticed his truck slowing down, they vanished with a speed that spoke to constant practice. The third time, he saw the older girl emerging from the public library, a bulging backpack slung over her shoulder. She moved with purpose and caution, checking over her shoulder regularly, but never quite looking directly at anything that might be watching her. Jake found himself admiring their competence, even as his heart broke for their situation. These kids had created a survival system that was keeping them alive and together. But they were still kids. They shouldn't have to be this good at being invisible. On Thursday morning, Jake made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of driving by the barn, he parked his truck at the grain elevator a quarter mile away and walked back through the cornfields, approaching the property from the blind side where the children wouldn't expect observation. He was curious about their daily routines, their living conditions, their apparent source of organization and leadership. If he was going to help them, and he was becoming increasingly certain that he wanted to, he needed to understand exactly what their situation was. What he discovered when he reached the barn amazed him. The children had transformed the old structure into something that was almost livable. The hayloft had been carefully arranged to create separate sleeping areas for different children, with actual walls built from strategically placed bales. They'd rigged a system to collect rainwater in clean containers, created a rudimentary kitchen area with a camping stove they'd obviously scavenged, and even established a small library of books in one corner. Everything was clean, organized, and obviously maintained according to strict rules. This wasn't a group of kids camping out temporarily. This was a functioning household, managed by children who'd had to grow up to fast, but had done so with remarkable competence. Jake was so absorbed in his observation that he almost missed the soft footstep behind him. "Are you planning to turn us in?" The voice was quiet, controlled, and belonged to the oldest girl, the one who was clearly the leader. Jake turned slowly, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. She stood about 10 feet away, positioned where she could run if necessary, but close enough to evaluate his response to her question. "I don't know," Jake answered honestly. "I'm trying to figure out what the right thing to do is." "The right thing is to leave us alone," Emma said firmly. "We're not hurting anybody. We're not causing problems. We're just trying to survive." Jake studied her face, seeing a maturity that no 12-year-old should possess. "How long have you been on your own?" "Long enough to know that adults usually make things worse, not better." "What happened to your parents?" Emma's expression didn't change, but Jake caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the question hit deep. "That's not your business." "You're right," Jake agreed. "But living in an abandoned barn is dangerous. What happens when winter comes? What happens if someone gets sick or hurt? We'll figure it out. We always do." The simple confidence in her voice was both heartbreaking and inspiring. These children had survived this long by being resourceful and self-reliant. But Jake could see the exhaustion behind Emma's defiant facade. She was carrying a weight that was too heavy for anyone, let alone a child. "This is my family's barn," Jake said gently. "We lost the farm 3 years ago, but I still come check on the property sometimes." Emma's posture shifted slightly, preparing for fight or flight. "Are you going to kick us out?" "I don't know," Jake repeated. "Can I ask you something?" Emma didn't respond, but she didn't run either, which Jake took as permission to continue. "If I could help you, really help you, not just call the authorities and hope for the best, would you let me help? How?" "I don't know yet. I'm still figuring this out. But you shouldn't have to do this alone. No kid should." For a moment, Jake saw something flicker across Emma's face, a glimpse of the frightened child, hidden beneath the competent survival expert. But then her defenses snapped back into place. "We are doing it alone," she said, "and we're doing fine. I can see that. You've done an amazing job taking care of everyone." "But Emma," he paused, realizing he'd used her name without knowing if she'd told him. "How do you know my name? I heard one of the other kids call you that yesterday morning." Emma processed this information, filing it away as evidence that this man had been watching them longer than she'd initially realized. "Emma," Jake continued, "what you've accomplished here is incredible. But you're one kid trying to be responsible for others. That's not sustainable long term. And deep down, you know it." Emma stared at him for a long moment, and Jake could see her weighing options, calculating risks, trying to determine if he represented opportunity or disaster. "If you call social services," she said finally, "they'll split us up. The twins will go to one family, Lily will go to another, Oliver somewhere else. We'll never see each other again. I know. And if you try to help us and it goes wrong, we'll be worse off than we are now." "That's possible," Jake admitted. "So why should I trust you?" It was the question Jake had been asking himself for 3 days. Why should she trust him? He was a stranger who'd discovered their secret and now claimed he wanted to help. From Emma's perspective, he represented everything dangerous about the adult world: unpredictability, authority, the power to destroy the fragile safety they'd built. "Because," Jake said slowly, "this used to be my home, My grandparents built this barn. My father worked this land. I learned to drive on these roads. This place matters to me, and you've been taking care of it. That has to count for something." Emma considered this, and Jake could see her sharp mind working through implications and possibilities. "What kind of help?" she asked finally. "I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out. Would you be willing to let me try?" Emma was quiet for so long that Jake began to think she'd simply walk away without answering. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "We'll think about it." Then she turned and disappeared into the cornfield, moving with the silent grace that only children who'd learned to be invisible could master. Jake stood alone in front of the barn that had sheltered his childhood memories and was now sheltering 5 children who needed more help than they were willing to admit. He had no idea how to help them, but he knew he was going to try. 3 days passed before Emma approached Jake again. He'd continued his routine of checking on the barn, but now he did it openly, working on actual repairs that the old structure genuinely needed. He fixed loose boards, cleared debris from the drainage ditches, and reinforced the sections of roof that were most likely to fail when winter arrived. He was replacing rotted boards on the barn's north wall when Emma materialized beside him with the startling suddenness of a cat. "You're actually fixing things," she observed, watching him work. Jake looked up from the board he was measuring. The roof was going to cave in if we got any more heavy rain. Seemed like a problem worth solving. Jake realized his slip and felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I meant, the barn. The structure needed repair." Emma studied the neat stack of new lumber he'd brought, the professional quality of his repair work, the obvious expense he was absorbing, without any promise of return on investment. "You could have just called the county and had us removed," she said finally. "It would have been simpler." Simpler isn't always better. Emma picked up one of his tools, a level that cost more than she'd seen in months, and turned it over in her hands with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to evaluate everything for potential utility. "The others want to meet you," she said without looking up from the tool. Jake's heart rate accelerated. "What did you tell them about me? That you know about us? That you haven't turned us in yet? That you might be able to help, but we don't know if we can trust you? What did they say?" "Oliver thinks you're probably okay because you're fixing the barn, instead of just taking pictures for evidence. Marcus and Maya think we should test you somehow before we decide anything. Lily wants to know if you have any food." Jake laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise Emma. "Lily has her priorities straight. She's 7. Food is pretty much her only priority." "What about you? What do you think?" Emma set down the level and looked directly at him for the first time since arriving. Her gaze was direct, assessing, uncomfortably mature. "I think you're either genuinely trying to help, or you're the most patient predator we've ever encountered." The bluntness of her evaluation hit Jake like a physical blow. Of course these children would have learned to think in terms of predators and threats. Of course Emma would have developed the cynical awareness necessary to keep her family safe from adults who might mean them harm. "I understand why you'd think that," Jake said carefully. "What would convince you that I'm not?" "Time," Emma replied immediately. "Consistency. Proving that your actions match your words over weeks and months, not just days. That's fair." "But Emma, winter's coming in a few months. Do you have a plan for heating this place? For dealing with snow and ice? For getting food when the farmers' market's close and the construction sites shut down?" Emma's jaw tightened. These were the questions that kept her awake at night, the problems she hadn't yet solved despite weeks of planning and worry. "We'll figure something out. I'm sure you will. You've figured out everything else. But what if you didn't have to figure it out alone? What are you proposing exactly?" Jake set down his hammer and faced her fully. "I don't know yet. I've been thinking about it for days, and I keep running into the same problems. You can't just move in with me. I'm single. I don't have legal authority to care for children, and social services would remove you the moment they found out. I can't adopt all 5 of you. The system doesn't work that way. I can't even legally help you without becoming an accessory to whatever laws you're breaking by living independently. So what can you do?" "I can make this place livable for winter. I can make sure you have reliable access to food and medical care. I can provide resources and support without trying to control your decisions or break up your family. Emma, was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of what he was offering. "What do you want in return?" "I want you to let me help. I want to know that you're safe and that the younger kids are getting what they need to grow up healthy." Why? It was the question Jake had been struggling with since he'd first discovered them. Why did he care? Why was he willing to invest time, money, and emotional energy in 5 children who weren't his responsibility? Because, he said slowly, "When I was 8 years old, my family went through a really rough patch. My dad lost his job. We were behind on the mortgage. My parents were fighting constantly. For about 6 months, I thought we were going to lose everything and end up separated." Emma listened with the focused attention of someone who understood the fear he was describing. "It didn't happen," Jake continued. "Dad found work. We caught up on the payments. The family stayed together. But during those 6 months, I used to lie awake at night terrified that I'd wake up in a foster home somewhere, never knowing what happened to my little sister. What does that have to do with us? You're living the nightmare I used to have, and you're doing it with more courage and competence than most adults could manage. But you shouldn't have to. No kid should." Emma considered this, and Jake could see her weighing his words against her experience of adults who made promises they couldn't or wouldn't keep. "If we let you help," she said finally, "there have to be rules." "What kind of rules?" "We stay together, no matter what. That's non-negotiable." "Agreed. We make our own decisions about our daily routines, our education, our behavior. You can advise, but you can't control." "That's reasonable. If any of us feels unsafe or uncomfortable with the arrangement, we have the right to leave immediately, no questions asked." "Understood. And if you ever try to turn us over to the authorities without our consent, we disappear and you never see us again." Jake nodded. "Those are fair terms. Do I get to propose any conditions?" Emma looked surprised. "Like what?" "Like, you have to let me know if anyone gets seriously sick or injured. You have to accept help with medical care and schooling. And you have to trust me enough to tell me if you're facing problems you can't solve on your own. We can solve our own problems. You've done an incredible job so far. But Emma, you're 12 years old. There are going to be situations that require adult intervention. Whether you like it or not." Emma's expression flashed with irritation at the reminder of her age. But Jake could see her rational mind working through the reality of his statement. "We'll consider it," she said. "But the others have to meet you first. They have to agree." "When?" "Tomorrow, after the lunch crowd clears at Murphy's and before the afternoon shift change at the construction site." Jake recognized the time slot. It was when the children would normally be returning to the barn with whatever food and supplies they'd managed to gather during their morning forays. "Should I bring anything?" Emma almost smiled. Food would probably win over Lily immediately. "And maybe some kind of proof that you're who you say you are and that you're not going to disappear the moment things get complicated." "What kind of proof?" "I don't know. That's for you to figure out." With that, Emma melted back into the cornfield, leaving Jake alone with his tools and a challenge that felt more important than any construction project he'd ever undertaken. That evening, Jake sat in his small apartment in town, trying to figure out how to prove his reliability to 5 children who'd learned not to trust adult promises. On his kitchen table, he spread out his family photos, his construction licenses, his lease agreement, his bank statements, any document that might demonstrate stability and commitment. But as he stared at the paper evidence of his life, Jake realized that documents weren't what these children needed to see. They needed proof that he understood what he was asking them to risk by trusting him. They needed to know that he was willing to risk something too. By morning, Jake had a plan that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He was about to offer 5 homeless children something that could change all their lives forever, including his own. But first, he had to convince them that he was worthy of the trust they'd never given to any adult before. The meeting took place in the barn's main floor, with the children arranged in a semicircle that allowed multiple escape routes, while giving them clear sight lines to evaluate Jake's expressions and body language. Emma sat in the center, with Oliver to her right and the twins flanking the younger children like protective bookends. Lily perched on a hay bale, swinging her legs and clutching the stuffed rabbit that was her most precious possession. Jake had brought sandwiches from the deli downtown, juice boxes, and a bag of apples that made Lily's eyes light up with genuine joy. But he'd also brought something else, a manila folder that contained documents he'd never shown to anyone outside of lawyers and bank officers. "Before we start," Jake said, settling cross-legged on the barn floor to put himself at the children's eye level, "I want to tell you what I'm risking by helping you." Emma raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jake opened the folder and pulled out an official-looking document. "This is a deed. It says that as of yesterday afternoon, I own 40 acres of farmland, including this barn." The children exchanged glances. Oliver spoke first. "You bought back your family's farm?" "Part of it. The most important part." Jake spread the deed where they could all see it. "I used every penny of my savings, plus a loan that's going to take me 15 years to pay off. My girlfriend thinks I've lost my mind. My parents are worried I've made a terrible financial decision, and my bank account is now basically empty." "Why?" Marcus asked. "Because I realize that if I'm going to help you, I need to be all in. I can't ask you to trust me with your family if I'm not willing to risk something real for mine." Emma leaned forward, studying the deed with the intense focus she brought to anything that might affect their survival. "What does this mean for us?" "It means this is legally my property now, so you're not trespassing. It means I can make improvements and modifications without anyone questioning my right to be here. And it means," Jake took a deep breath, "it means I'm proposing something that's probably crazy, definitely complicated, and might not work, but could solve most of your immediate problems." "Which is?" Oliver prompted. Jake pulled out a second set of documents. "I want to convert this barn into a real home. Insulation, heating, plumbing, electricity. Separate bedrooms for each of you. I want to homeschool you legally, get you proper medical care. Make sure you have everything you need to grow up healthy and educated." The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the wind moving through the corn outside. "You want to adopt us?" Maya asked finally. "I can't adopt you, not all 5, not the way the system works, but I can become your legal guardian if we can prove that placing you with me serves your best interests better than separating you through traditional foster care." "How?" Emma's voice was carefully controlled, but Jake could see the hope she was trying not to let herself feel. "There's something called kinship care," Jake explained. "It's designed for situations where children need to be placed with relatives or close family friends. We have to stretch the definition a little, but if we can demonstrate that you've been living independently successfully, that you function as a family unit, and that I can provide the stability and resources you need while respecting your existing bonds, we could stay together," Lily whispered, her voice full of wonder. "You could stay together. Here, on land that no one can take away, in a home that's built specifically for your family." Emma stood up and walked to the barn door, staring out at the fields that stretched to the horizon. Jake could see her mind working through possibilities and obstacles, calculating risks and potential benefits. "What's the catch?" she asked without turning around. "Several catches," Jake admitted. "First, we have to involve social services eventually. We can't do this completely outside the system. We need legal protection for all of us. Second, it's going to take months to get everything set up properly, and winter's coming fast. Third, there's no guarantee it'll work. The courts might decide that traditional foster placement is better for you. And fourth," Emma turned to face him, and Jake could see that she'd already identified another problem. "Fourth, it changes everything between us. Right now, you're independent. You make your own decisions, set your own rules, take care of yourselves. If I become your legal guardian, I have responsibility for your welfare, your education, your daily lives. That means some of your autonomy gets traded for security and stability." Oliver had been listening intently to the entire conversation. "What would the rules be?" "We'd figure them out together, but the basics would be school in some form, whether that's homeschooling or eventually transitioning to regular school, medical care when you need it, chores and responsibilities around the property, respect for each other and for the neighbors. Normal family stuff. We're not a normal family," Marcus pointed out. "No," Jake agreed. "You're better than normal. You're a family that chose each other and fought to stay together against impossible odds." You're a family that's taken care of each other through situations that would have broken apart most adults. You're the strongest family I've ever seen." Emma returned to the group, settling back into her position as unofficial leader. "We need to talk about this alone." "Of course, take all the time you need." Jake stood to leave, but Lily's small voice stopped him. "Mr. Jake, if we say yes, will you really build us bedrooms?" Jake knelt down to her level. "I'll build you the most beautiful bedroom you've ever seen, Lily, with windows that look out over the cornfields and shelves for all your books, and space for that rabbit to have his own little bed." Lily beamed, but then her expression grew serious. "And you won't leave? Even if we're sometimes difficult?" The question hit Jake in the chest like a physical blow. This child, all of these children had been abandoned by the adults who were supposed to protect them. Their greatest fear wasn't poverty or hunger or cold. It was being left behind again. "Lily, honey, families don't leave each other. Sometimes they argue, sometimes they disagree, sometimes they have to work through problems together. But they don't leave. That's what makes them families." Emma watched this exchange with something that might have been the beginning of trust forming in her eyes. "Give us an hour," she said. Jake nodded and walked outside, his heart pounding with the magnitude of what he'd just proposed. He sat on the old tractor and waited, watching clouds gather on the horizon and thinking about how his life had been completely upended by 5 children hiding in a barn. When the hour was up, Emma appeared in the doorway. The other children stood behind her in a formation that reminded Jake of a small army preparing for battle. "We have conditions," Emma announced. "I'm listening. First, we want everything in writing. Legal documents that say we stay together no matter what happens." "Agreed." "Second, if this doesn't work out, we want a backup plan. Somewhere safe we can go without ending up separated by the system." Jake had been thinking about this too. "I have a cousin in Oregon who runs a group home for kids aging out of foster care. She's agreed to be our emergency contact if we need an alternative placement that keeps you together." The children exchanged glances. They hadn't expected him to have thought that far ahead. "Third," Oliver said, stepping forward, "we want to help make the decisions about how our new home gets built and how our family works. We don't want things done to us. We want things done with us." "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." Marcus spoke next. "We want to keep some of our independence, jobs in town, ways to earn our own money, spaces that are just ours. Of course," finally, Maya added, "and we want to know that you understand what you're signing up for. We're not going to be perfect kids who never cause problems. We've been through things that most adults can't handle. Sometimes we have nightmares, sometimes we don't trust easily. Sometimes we're going to test whether you really mean it when you say you won't leave." Jake looked at each of their faces. Emma's carefully controlled hope, Oliver's analytical assessment, the twins' protective solidarity, Lily's cautious optimism, and felt something shift in his chest. These weren't just children who needed help. They were people who'd survived impossible circumstances and emerged stronger, smarter, and more capable than many adults he knew. "I understand," he said, "and I want you to know something too. I'm not trying to replace whatever family you had before. I'm not trying to be your father or fix your past, or pretend that everything that happened to you was okay. I'm just trying to be part of your future, if you'll let me." Emma looked at each of her siblings, receiving small nods of agreement. When she turned back to Jake, her expression had changed. The defensive wariness was still there, but underneath it, for the first time, was something that looked like trust. "Okay," she said simply, "let's try it." 18 months later, the old Morrison barn had been transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a home and garden magazine. The main floor had become a spacious common area with a kitchen, dining space, and living room that could accommodate a family of 6. The loft had been converted into bedrooms, each one reflecting the personality of its occupant. Emma's room was organized and efficient, with built-in desks for her homeschool work and carefully labeled storage for everything, from clothes to art supplies. Oliver's space looked like a young scientist's laboratory, complete with microscopes and chemistry sets and charts tracking everything, from weather patterns to crop rotations. The twins had adjacent rooms connected by a doorway, allowing them privacy while maintaining their special bond. And Lily's room was exactly what Jake had promised: windows overlooking the fields, shelves full of books, and a special bed for her rabbit. But the real transformation wasn't in the building. It was in the family that had grown within it. Jake. Lily's trying to feed pancakes to the chickens again. Oliver called from the kitchen one Saturday morning. They like pancakes. Lily's voice drifted from the yard. Mr. Clucky told me so. Jake looked up from the legal documents. He was reviewing final paperwork for the guardianship arrangement that had taken 14 months to navigate, and grinned. His quiet, solitary life had become chaotic, noisy, complicated, and absolutely perfect. Emma appeared in the doorway, carrying a cup of coffee she'd learned to make exactly the way he liked it. At 14, she was taller, healthier, and had begun to let herself act like a teenager instead of a tiny adult. Carrying the weight of the world, the social worker called, she said. Final inspection is next week. Nervous, a little, but not like before. Before, I was nervous that they'd take us away from each other. Now I'm just nervous that we'll pass all their tests and this will be officially, legally real. Jake set down his papers and looked at the girl who'd been brave enough to trust him with the most precious thing she had, her family. It's already real, Emma. The papers just make it official, I know. But the papers matter too. They mean that nobody can separate us ever again. Through the window, they could see Marcus teaching Maya how to change the oil in Jake's truck, while Oliver supervised with the intensity of a foreman and Lily danced around them, with her stuffed rabbit, singing a song she'd made up about engines and families and pancakes. Jake, Emma's voice was softer now, more tentative. Yeah, thank you for seeing us, for not giving up when we were difficult, for believing that we were worth the risk. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. Emma, you guys were never a risk. You were the best investment I ever made. She smiled a real smile, the kind that transformed her entire face, and went back to supervising the chaos in the yard. That evening, as the family sat around the dinner table that Jake had built from reclaimed barn wood, Lily raised her glass of milk in a toast. To our family, she announced with the solemnity of someone making a royal proclamation, which is the best family in the whole world because we chose each other, and nobody can unchoose us ever again. To our family, they echoed, and as Jake looked,